we can chat over, and we will make some questions over the chat. So if you want to use the chat, please join in, say hi, say where are you joining from, and we're really thankful for you to be here. So again, I'm Diego Del Moro. I am Mexican. I am the co-founder of the Collective of Disruptive Design. We will get into the collective in a little bit, but we're really pleased for you to have you here, and we will record this open class so you can check it out later. And so thank you very much, and we will start right now. So what exactly is systems change, and what exactly we're talking about the Collective of Disruptive Design? The Collective of Disruptive Design, it's a group of people from Latin America. We are specialists, consultants, facilitators, and social innovators from different walks of life who are committed to generate positive social and environmental impact from the perspective of disruptive design. So what exactly is disruptive design? For now, I will just leave it in a very broad term, because we will get back to that after today's class. But as we are focused on Latin America, we have nodes or chapters in some major cities in Latin America. We have nodes in Bogota, Colombia, in Mexico, both in Mexico City and Guadalajara, in Peru, in Lima, and in Brazil, in Rio and in Sao Paulo. So we're kind of this distributed collective, and we're mainly focused on Latin America, although we have made some different boot camps and workshops around the world as well. So what exactly do we mean by disruptive design? As I told you, we will get into that at the end of this presentation into more depth. But right now, we just want to leave that we work in the intersection of systems thinking and design thinking. So in that intersection of a more strategic approach, but also on design level of what is desirable, feasible, and it's needed for the people who are involved in that kind of particular problem, it's where we work at. So that is the disruptive design approach that we want to get people from Latin America to embrace it, to make a Latin American more native approach to this, and to generate more impact approaches that are more south to south or south to north. So this is the exact purpose of the collective. So to get the minds warming for this session on systems change, I would like you to tell me over the chat what kind of big social changes have already happened. You know, like the most important social changes that already happened in the past. So you can make your comments through the chat, and we will read it out loud, so to know a little bit more about why you think these changes already happened. What kind of change happened? Okay. So for instance, let's think about slavery. the abolition of slavery is a big social change that happened in the recent past, or different women's rights, the right to vote, the right to be elected, to have property, things that unfortunately we did not have in 30 years. So thinking about those changes, let's get to the next question. How did you see these changes happen? How did these changes occur? And there's different ways of reading this, but for instance, in terms of slavery, there is like this history approach in which slavery was kind of abolished in different countries throughout the world, kind of in a consecutive order. In the United States, it prompted a whole war, a whole civil war for that to happen. And in some places, it was less confrontative, probably because the problem wasn't as a big issue as other countries. But the reflection here, and taking again that example of slavery or women's rights, is that it is not just the work of certain people, you know. We can probably see the movie Amistad that talks about this ship of slaves in the United States, or think about the civil rights movement in the U.S. or certain figures, you know, like Martin Luther King or Rosa Parks, that can be indicators of these people enacting this kind of bigger change. The reality is that all of those actors, all of those initiatives did have something to do with that social change. So yes, it was the rebellion, it was the wars, but it was also these ideologies. It was also taking it to the public. It was also some boycotts. It was also the different policies that were enacted and regulations. So all of those changes happened thanks to the changes that concurred to join for that bigger systems change. So all of these changes had to do with that, and all of those answers are right. But let's step a little bit back and think about why systems change important. And this is an example of Tanzania. And in Tanzania, there was this big problem with malaria. Still, it's a big problem in Tanzania and in different other countries. And the problem with malaria was started being tackled by mosquito nets. So these mosquito nets were distributed throughout the country through different nonprofits and international organizations for free. And it did started tackling the malaria transmission problem, right? So this disease was starting lowering the cases, but on the other hand, other issues that was completely unforeseen in that part of the intervention arise. So what kind of problems arise with the mosquito net distribution? Well, for instance, all of the mosquito net providers, the local providers of mosquito nets, both importers and producers of mosquito nets, went bankrupt because you have a steady source of free mosquito nets, and you no longer have a market to sell it because there are all of these organizations that are giving them for free, right? For instance, people started doing a lot of stuff with this material, stuff that people didn't even foresee. They started doing tutus, and they started doing gowns for like wedding gowns, taking this kind of cloth. And they also use it for fishing because of the mosquito nets. They had like very tiny, very thin holes. They started using it for fishing. The problem with using these mosquito nets for fishing was that these mosquito nets are impregnated with insecticide, with DDT, and this insecticide contaminated the water, the lakes and the rivers of these people, and also their food. And so the big teaching, the big learning here, it was that it is important to have a systemic approach, because if not, we can have unintended consequences. And that can be some example of different unintended consequences that can happen if we see problems that are complex, if we see them in a very linear way. But as well as there's unintended consequences, there are other more positive effects. And this is an example of a dear friend from Brazil that it's called Edgar Gouveia. And it has this game that's called Primavera X. And this game, it's a game that is not played online. It's a game that is played in real life. So what this game did, it was engaging children, much like elementary school children, into saving the different water sources that they were near their communities. So they give out certain challenges for these kids to develop throughout their communities, and through an app that they could download, or the teacher at their school could download, or their parents could download. And in this app, we're asking them to first of all accept the challenge, because they were like superheroes that were chosen for facing this challenge. And after accepting the challenge, they had to make a group, because like superheroes doesn't work alone. They have to make a group of other kids who want to tackle these problems. And after doing this, you'll have to make alliance group and look out for partners. And they were like this kids looking for partners both in their community and in government, and like pop stars. They were like trying to reach like pop stars for joining like this kind of movement. Then they were asked to focus or to find their closest water source, or the closest water body they have around their neighborhood. And once they found it, they have to find both the ill that this body of water has, but also the cure. And many of these cures were like get-togethers for cleaning up beaches, for cleaning up lakes, for incentivizing people to, or campaign for people to not throw their trash into the river. And this also had a cascading effect, right? So if we have a more systemic approach, we have a system thinking approach when we design our interventions, or when we design or make our programs, we can unleash positive cascading effects. Because we now have more engaged citizens, but also more engaged communities. We already have probably a channel of communication with different levels of government that otherwise would never have happened. We already have now a more awareness of the body the bodies of water around certain neighborhoods and the importance of these water resources in different latitudes around Brazil. So there was a huge movement. It mobilized millions of people here in Brazil, and it has a positive cascading effect that it's now trying to be replicated through other programs and also through different kinds of activities, which is great, right? So if we want to make this systems change, what kind of tools do we have to identify the system that we're trying to change, right? So we're gonna check into 3 different kind of tools. And if you have any other tools, if you have used them, you can put that in the comments. We will read them. But these 3 tools are just an example. It is not all of the tools that are available. It's just like a sample of 3 tools for identifying the system that we're working in. But obviously there are many, right? So what kind of these tools are, and we're going to check about. The first one is called systems practice. The other one is the iceberg model, and the third one is mapping the behavior over time. So getting into systems practice, this approach was developed by a media group, and it takes into account how to identify patterns. So as we know these kind of patterns, then we know how these patterns interact. No, ¿no se está escuchando? ¿No? Yep, okay. Sorry, you have a temporary glitch. We got logged out of the phone. So I will just log this for a little bit. Okay. So talking about patterns, how these different actors and how these different parts of the system interact. So for instance, back again into the slavery example. So for instance, slavery, one pattern of slavery, it was slave trade was driven by an economic incentive, right? So there was this thing about these big colonies, Portugal, Spain, England, using persons as goods and exchanging those goods for other goods and funding their richness through this practice, right? So that's one pattern. But there are other patterns. For example, the production models in America, right? So we have in North America the cotton fields. In South America we had the cane fields, and other kinds of production models that a very intense manual labor was needed, right? So if we take, for example, taking just these two patterns, now we see how these patterns interact, right? Because this model of production needed the economic model of slave trade, of a slave trade, of transatlantic slave trade. So that was something that kind of had a synergy in between them. So once we know that, we can start thinking into leverage points. Leverage points in systems practice is what kind of intervention with the smallest amount of effort can have the biggest impact or the biggest cascading effect or in the whole system. So for instance, let's think about a boycott on consuming these kinds of sources of these production models. Probably this kind of sourcing will disrupt the whole model and stop some parts in certain regions of slavery. Or let's think about a leverage point on the wars that these colonies had. Probably if they stop having wars and they didn't find this economic model so enticing, they will probably stop doing that. That's kind of one of the approaches of systems practice. This is an example that it's often used, that it's called systems archetypes. This is an archetypes of in this case, it was about the investment that certain NGOs does for evaluating their programs. And probably they don't have a good enough incentive for them to evaluate their programs with a more rigorous approach. So what they do is just keep on in this loop of checking outcomes indicators, like how many people did I attended, or how many users do I have of my product or of my service. And these other kind of metrics of how did this actually change these people's life it gets shifted, and all the time it gets shifted because we kind of get addicted to just finding and showing this kind of positive information. And if we do not have just positive information, it's harder for us to make this kind of changes. And this is also quite interesting to realize that many and all of the systems will have delays. So many of the symptoms or many of the effects that changes in the systems occur will have a delay, a very long delay over time. So what will happen is certain policy or certain change in the system will take longer to show up the consequences. For instance, what happened in many cities in the United States that began a big expansion toward the suburbs. In the early days, the getting into the suburbs, it wasn't that of a problem. It wasn't that much of a problem because people could move back and forth quite easily. But as the suburbs got way more dense with population, the traffic jams started appearing for getting from the suburbs to the center of the city where most of the jobs are. But for that traffic jam to start showing up, or to start like really building up, it took a very, very long time. for all these suburbs to like really get really populated, right? So that's kind of like also a good reflection on systems, that these delays will happen into a lot of time. We can also have an approach, and we can also map systems through an iceberg model. Have any one of you used the iceberg model before? You can show us your answers in the chat. So the iceberg model, it's a model where, as an iceberg, we can only see like the top of the iceberg, and that's some of the events or some of the symptoms of the problem. So, for instance, in the case of again, the contamination due to personal use vehicles, the traffic jam will be just a symptom. It's just like the tip of the iceberg. But underneath the water, there are some patterns that kind of scaffold that symptom. For instance, the big investment or people thinking that for having a normal and healthy life, they need a car, and having like a car, like a very normalized way of moving around cities instead of using public transportation, right? So so that's some pattern that upholds that. And underneath that, there are certain structures that it can be also like physical structures, but also more like political or regulatory structures. For example, the physical structure will be the highway systems, and building infrastructure for more cars. That's kind of infrastructure that helps that kind of behavior to happen, that kind of symptoms to emerge. Also, another structure could be the regulatory structures about, I don't know, policies for building infrastructure for public transport, right? So if it's more difficult for governments to build infrastructure, they will probably not build it, right? And the mental models, for example, what kind of mental models uphold that kind of symptoms? For example, the mental model that driving a car is easier, or that public transport, it's for lower income people, right? So those kind of mental models are pretty much what upholds of that. And this kind of iceberg model, what it tells is that if we change these mental models or these paradigms, we can have a bigger effect on the change that we want in the system, right? And lastly, behavior over time. So behavior over time, what it says is that in one axis we have how prominent is that behavior, and in another axis we have how does this behavior changes over time. So we can have an example here, again, with cycling infrastructure. So if we began building more cycling infrastructure, little by little, people will start leaving their car and using their bicycle to cycle to work. That's kind of like very linear approach, but that kind of also helps us to think what kind of these changes can have an effect throughout the time. For example, changing the behavior for sharing, right? If we build probably more shared vehicles lanes, we will encourage more people to share their vehicle. Will that happen or not? What other things we need to take into account to realize that would happen or not, right? So that's also one kind of approach. And the question for participants again, what can we do after mapping a system? So once we know what are the main actors, what are the main patterns, and how does these patterns interact, what do we do with that kind of information? What we do in the collective is we began a designing process. So once we realize what are the leverage points or what kind of people are already engaged in trying to address these problems, we start like a design phase in which we try along these actors to improve that kind of situation. So a very good example of this is what it's called zero fatalities or a zero deaths movement, that it was an alliance and a partnership that joined both the automotive industry and the cycling activists. So one of these leverage points that they realized that was something that both cyclists and both automotive industry were on the same page, it was road deaths. So they both agreed they could have a program to have like a common goal, and this common goal was going to be to have zero accidents on the highways or zero accidents on the roads. And through different actions, both for cyclists, both for car drivers and for the automotive industry, to lower speed limits, to increase programs on awareness of not driving without texting, also driving without drinking and all that. That was kind of a good example of what can we do after mapping a system. And do we have any questions as of now? There's some background music happening. If we do not have any questions, I will get into the last part. And we can obviously, if you have questions, you can put it out there and we'll read it. But it's what exactly is disruptive design. So now that we check how can we or some of the tools that we have to map the system, disruptive design help us to create this kind of strategic interventions that have this systemic context approach, which is thanks to through this mindset of system thinking, but also leveraging with the design thinking approach, that it will be more desirable for the people and that it will affect more effective social change, right? So that's the disruptive design approach. We use or we nurture for different approaches such as complexity and systems thinking that we just talked about, of social innovation and design thinking. and also on behavioral sciences and gamification, which means that complexity and systems thinking help us in realizing what part of the bigger problem we are and how all of these problems and issues interact. Social innovation and design thinking help us out in ground this into more specific programs or projects or interventions that can have a positive effect in the people and the stakeholders engaged. And behavioral sciences helps us into realizing why people choose the options that they choose and to have a better approach to that. So if we know why people will look into the more easy and already ready option, we kind of design it because of that. And also on gamification for social change, we will try to bring gamification approaches to non-gamification environments. For example, looking into the real incentives of people into doing this. We have some reference that we will share with you guys. This reference, if you want to look further into these approaches, two are in English, is in English, two are in Spanish, but it's quite easy to translate with like Google Translate. We'll put right out in the references. If you're keen into getting into more specifics on workshops or courses, there is some courses on the Plus Acumen platform that it's soon to be changed into Acumen Academy. That's called Systems Practice. And there is also a program that it's now being run by Ashoka on systems change. And we also have a bootcamp that we do in pretty much in Latin America, but we do some workshops on these specific subjects in the US. We have done one in Los Angeles, one in Las Vegas, and we have done two in Madrid and Barcelona specifically. And we are looking into possible partners who wants to bring this kind of courses and workshops to wherever you are. So if you want to get in contact with us, this bootcamp is